Alright, so I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the techniques that I developed specifically for my Ancient Cistern environment. So as you can see, there's a lot of surface detail going on. We'll start where you look, the surface is raised out. It's using tessellated displacement, and it's vertex blended into different texture sets. So a texture set, you'll hear me reference a lot in this video, is basically just your combination of diffuse, normal, height, roughness, all the maps that create a single surface. So like the stone would be one texture set, this dirt is one texture set, etc. So I'm developing this environment as a VR experience, so I wanted to keep the performance as high as possible, but I also wanted to have as much detail as possible within the immediate view distance of the player. So in order to achieve this, I'm using a lot of tessellated displacement, which is much cheaper to render than actually having all this detail baked into static meshes. And it's also gives you more control in the editor over how the surface looks. So one of the main issues I had when I first started developing this environment was that, well, I had tessellation resolution, fade distances where it would fade to a low resolution. It would not fade the height. So if I used static mesh LODs and it switched over to a lower resolution mesh and still had the height values on it, the surfaces would not line up because you have a lower resolution mesh meeting up with a higher resolution mesh with height values being spread across those two different resolutions. So this almost this entire environment structure, the walls, the ceiling, the floor, is actually made up of a single grid mesh, as you can see here, that's just instanced out over and over, and then has vertex paint added to it to break up the details. And the material itself is using world alignment. So as you can see, the stones all stay in one place and all that, so you don't get any seams between the meshes. So if I open up one of these, or open up the main grid mesh here, you can see what it looks like. As you can see, it's just a 512 poly mesh. That's just a tessellated grid mesh. And you pull out and it goes down to a 2 poly grid mesh. So in order to fix the issue of having two different resolution meshes meet up with the same height value, I created a height faded distance, which is uses the same setup as the tessellation fade distance, but it basically flattens out the surface distance. So I can give you an example of how this is working here. You can ignore those little artifacts you see in the tessellation. This has to do with the distance value I have set for testing purposes. So if you keep an eye on this surface right here, right in front of the entrance, you can see the height fade in effect. See how the surface raises and lowers depending on our view distance from it. Now when you have all the environmental effects and the fog and the lighting and all that enabled, it's not noticeable. It's a very subtle effect, and I'll probably adjust the fade distance of it in the final version of this environment. But I'll show you again here from this angle. So keep your eye on this surface right here. As you move in, you can see the surface details raise up out of the flatness. And when it goes to the completely flat surface, it swaps over to that 2 poly by 2 poly mesh. And it's doing the same thing for all of the surfaces that have that tessellated displacement. So these pillars, all that swaps over to a lower poly mesh once the height fades down to 0. And then to give you an idea of what it looks like in wireframe, as you can see when we're close to the surface, it's got a pretty high resolution tessellation value going on. And as we pull away from it, you'll see that tessellation value slowly get lower. And then it finally swaps over into a 2 poly version of the grid mesh, rather than the 512 poly version. So it's very performance optimized. It works very well. You get a lot of detail at close view distance, and at farther distance it doesn't render anything at all for the most part. Now let's go over some more advanced features of the material. Turn back on all the environmental effects again. So as I said, the entire purpose of the way I set up this environment was to have as much detail as possible with as little performance hit as possible. Because this is going to be a VR environment. So right now I'm running on a MSI 980 Ti, and I'm averaging 90 to 120 frames with everything maxed out. So it's working pretty well. I'm targeting mid to high end for VR. By the time VR is mainstream, around the beginning or middle of next year, this will run well on mid-range hardware. So let's go over some more of the features of this base material that I'm using for almost the entire environment. So I'll show you real quick the height fade in action. You can see the surface raising and lowering based on the values I'm putting in. So you can set a minimum and maximum fade distance, so you get a nice gradient fade out. So this displacement material is based on one that I actually released on the marketplace a while ago, but I heavily modified it, optimized it, and added a bunch of new features. So all the texture sets are adjustable individually. So for example, I can adjust just the height of these stones if I want to. This is also one of the benefits, as I said, of using tessellated displacement over baking the geometry into a mesh, is that you get this kind of control over it in Editor. You can obviously adjust the tiling individually, make the stones as large or as small as you like. Let's see, I can go in and adjust the, this is something new I added for the material, I can go in and adjust the rotation value individually for each texture set. So you can get a lot of variation in your surfaces with not much performance overhead. It's obviously got color adjustments. It's all tied to a Fresnel, so you get inner and outer color values, nice rim color effects, all that good stuff. Obviously metallic values, roughness values you can set up. Has all the standard features of a standard material per texture set. Now another cool thing that I added to this material is, if you can see it here, between the stones is I have some water flowing. So this is an ancient cistern which the Romans used as basically a water containers type structure. So I thought it would make sense to have, there's water everywhere. You got water dripping from the ceiling, you got water fountains on the side, and I thought it would make sense to have some water flowing in between the stones. So I added a wet map feature. So the wet map allows you to have a wet map separately for each texture set. Now it doesn't have to be water, it could be algae, it could be ice, it could be all kinds of stuff. And it's masked using the height map of that texture set, and it's got a mask bias. You can adjust the spread of it and all that stuff. You can also adjust the diffuse colors, once again tied to Fresnel. So if you want to have I don't know, blood flowing through the stones or something like that, you can do that. You can adjust the speed and direction of the wet map, make the water faster, or make it flow a different direction. You can adjust the overall tiling of the normal on the wet map. You can get some cool effects depending on what you're using it for. You can obviously adjust the roughness, and you have full control over that per texture set as well. So you'll see that I've also got that wet map being used on this dirt here, or this mud. It's just a lot more subtle and moving more slowly and more spread out. So, since we're on the topic of water, this is my new water material that I created specifically for this environment. So as you can see, it's also got tessellated displacement. The surface is rippling, and you have little waves going around, and it's a pretty convincing water effect. And then you go underneath, and you have a post-process volume that's changing the fog, screen color, depth of field. All that stuff's being changed by this subsurface, or I'm sorry, this post-process volume. So with the water itself, I mean, you have control over obviously the diffuse color. Once again, you can make it blood, or you know, you can make it blue water, green water, whatever you want to do with it. It's also got that's tied to Fresnel as well. You also have subsurface values, so you can have some subsurface color mixed in with your diffuse color that will give it some depth. You obviously have refraction adjustment. You can make the water more or less refractive, or more intense of a refraction. You have overall tiling of the surface, so you can make it larger or smaller depending on your needs. I have a visibility adjustment, which is basically adjusting how murky or clear the water is, the visibility of the water, or the fog value if you like. And as you see, when I move the water surface up and down, you can see that the fog is actually based on the distance from the surface of the water to the distance of the surface to the surface below it. So it's all adjusting in real time. And you can obviously, you know, adjust. I won't go into all the details about the waves and everything, but you can adjust the wave direction, height, intensity, speed, undulation of the water. So the undulation of the water, I will go into real quick. So the undulation is basically movement of the entire body of water up and down. And I will speed up the effects so you can see it in action. So something like this is good for an ocean or a lake or any kind of large body of water. And yeah, you can adjust the scale of it as well, and all that. So obviously for this body of water I'm not using any undulation, but it's there. So the next material I want to go over is this flame material, which I created also specifically for this environment. So this is actually a low resolution video file applied to a conical tessellated mesh, and then I'm using pretty much the same technique that I'm using for the water, just modified for fire. So I can adjust wind speed, intensity, size of the flame, speed of the flame, all that through the material. I can also go in and adjust values like color. This green flame kind of reminds me of Soul Reaver. I don't know if anybody remembers that game. You can obviously adjust the emissive power, so how bright the flame is if you like. You can get some really cool effects. And you know, it supports temporal AA and all that if your video file isn't all that great, or however you want to use it, but that's what that material is. Now let's move into the foliage material that I'm using here. So these leaves are using the foliage shader that Epic released in a recent version of the engine, but I created my own material around it that allows for some advanced adjustments through instancing. As you can see, the leaves themselves actually have a slight motion to them. Using a wind value, you can make this, you know, higher or lower as you like. If you have like a really windy environment, you obviously want them moving really fast. But you know, they have subsurface scattering, all the cool effects that you'd expect foliage to have. So these vines that the leaves are applied to, they're actually created, as you can see, they're coming through the skylight here, or they're coming through the grate here. They're wrapping around the grate, wrapping around the surface of the shaft, and around the ceiling, and around the statue and all that. I actually created these using splines. I got this spline from a package that was on the marketplace, and then I modified it a lot. The only thing I'm still really using from the original package is this ivy mesh, but I'm going to be changing it because it's not very well optimized for my environment. And then, you know, I applied my leaves to it, obviously. So after I drew out the splines, I applied the leaves using the foliage editor, using the fill tool and the foliage editor with some, obviously I modified all the rotation, and scale values and density and all that good stuff. So right now I have about 1,200 instances of these leaves. In the final version I'll have the same amount of instances, but there'll be more variation. So I have different shaped leaves, different colored leaves, that'll all be based on the single base material. And then since it is running applied using the foliage editor, it's very cheap to render that many of them, and then they obviously fade out at distance. They have a cool little dissolve effect with them. So it works well. So the last thing I'll go over is the lighting. So you notice here there's a little bit of a lighting glitch. I think it has to do with the vertex paint that I have set up here. I might have to go in and repaint it. But yeah, that'll be fixed obviously in the final version of the environment. So you'll notice that this environment has a lot of atmosphere. It has a very thick feel to it. It's supposed to be an ancient underground setting, and I wanted to have a lot of thickness in the air and fog going on. So the fog, I'm actually using a bunch of different fog sheets. I'm using exponential height fog and some particle fog effects that all fade out at distance seamlessly. So almost this entire room is actually being lit by a single dominant directional with a high bounce and global illumination value. And then I've obviously got some detail lights here and there to kind of brighten up some darker areas. And then I have these spotlights shining down on these lions' heads, and then I have a spotlight here that's shining up into the statue just to kind of give it more presence in the scene. Because when you start the environment, you're basically this is gonna be your view right here. So I wanted it to stand out. So the dominant directional that I'm using to light almost this entire room by itself is just a single dominant directional with a -90 angle. Now, normally if I were to do this without, if I just built the entire environment using static meshes and then put that dominant directional, there'd be nothing to block the light because these are just one-sided grids that wouldn't block any light coming through. So what I did is I put the entire environment inside of a BSB block and then subtracted out the space for the environment using subtractive BSB. And as you can see, I created an opening here at the top of this shaft through the BSB and then made a funnel shape to bring the light in, because if I had just made it a square shaft straight up, you would get the shadow from the square rather than the shape of the shaft and the vines and all that. So that's how I achieved the lighting that you see in the environment. And then another cool thing about having that dominant directional is these God rays or light shafts, whatever you want to call them, coming through the grate up there. You'll see I also have some dust motes flying around to sell the effect a little bit more, and then when you pull out, there's a light shaft blueprint going on that helps sell the effect even more. So the light shafts. So these light shafts, in Unreal Engine 4, they're only supported on the dominant directional light actor. In Unreal Engine 3, you could have light shafts on any point light actor, and you can only have single dominant directional supplying these light shafts. So if I were to create, say, a hole in this wall here, you wouldn't get a light shaft, but if I had one here that allowed for a 90-degree angle coming in, then you'd get another light shaft. So anywhere that I put holes in the ceilings, you would see those light shafts and have the light coming through and bouncing around. So that's how I achieved the lighting that you see going on. And then I've also got a spotlight actor right here. If I go into unlit mode, you can see it. That's shining down. That's actually just creating a nice light fall off here. You can see that it's got a nice penumbra to it. So that's pretty much it. This is just the entry point for the environment. This is only a small part of what the environment's going to look like when it's done. The large part of the environment, which is going to be when you walk through this tunnel here and you come out on the other end, it's going to open up into a large part of the environment that's going to be 8 to 10 times the size of this room that you see here. And there's going to be a lot of cool stuff going on in there that I'll be showing off soon, but I'm not ready to show off just yet. So that's it. If you have any questions on anything that I went over, just let me know.